Started and that's important. So yeah, so welcome everyone and thank you everyone for joining. I can't wait to introduce our wonderful guests for today's discussion on what a progressive US foreign policy should look like. So I'm Joey Leone. I'm a master's student in public policy and a co-chair of the Progressive Caucus at HKS. And before we get started, I just want to say a couple quick words about the Progressive Caucus. So we're a student group here at the Kennedy School working to advance racial, social, environmental, and economic justice for all. And we also just launched a student journal called the Progressive Policy Review, which you can find online at ppr.hkspublications.org. And if you want to get involved in the caucus or with the journal, you can reach out to us at progressivecaucushks@gmail.com. So we're really excited. This is our first event of the semester. And to provide some background for today's discussion, as we approach a new year and a new presidential administration in the US, the world remains confronted by many enormous challenges, crises, and injustices. Among these are the COVID-19 pandemic, nearly 2 decades of the US-led war on terror, climate change, the wars in Yemen, Afghanistan, and Syria, mass displacement, xenophobia, and the militarization of borders, as well as rising right-wing authoritarianism, the ongoing occupation of Palestine, and increased tensions between the US and China, to name a few. While we're all, of course, thrilled to see the end of the Trump administration, which has fueled so many of these crises, we know that these injustices have progressed under both Republican and Democratic administrations and will not suddenly disappear with the election of Joe Biden. To meet these pressing challenges of our time, a true progressive alternative to the status quo is essential, and it's needed now. Each of our speakers today has worked admirably to help move us toward that progressive alternative and to imagine a more peaceful and just future. I'm really thrilled to introduce our speakers for this discussion, all of whom I admire greatly. So first we have Khury Petersen-Smith, who's the Michael Ratner Middle East Fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. Khury researches, writes, and speaks about US empire and resistance in the Middle East and the Pacific. Khury focuses especially on the war on terror, US support for Israel, and the Palestinian struggle for justice, as well as US militarization and resistance movements in Asia and the Pacific. Next, we have Shireen al-Adeimi, who is an assistant professor of education at Michigan State University. And since 2015, she's played an active role in raising awareness about the Saudi-led war on her country of birth, Yemen, and works to encourage political action to end US support for the war. And last but not least, we have Tobita Chow, who is the director of Justices Global, a special project of People's Action to build a more just and sustainable global economy and defeat right-wing nationalism. His recent work focuses on the US-China relationship and the growth of xenophobia under the COVID-19 crisis. You can follow Tobita on Twitter at TobitaC. So we want this event to be as much of a discussion as possible, so please submit your questions over the Zoom so that we can address them as part of the discussion and Q&A. I also invite our panelists to respond to one another and ask each other questions as they see fit. And after all that, so without further ado, I want to ask our panelists, starting with Khury, to discuss their work and to describe what a progressive US foreign policy should look like and how we can make it happen. But first, join me in giving all of our panelists a warm welcome. And so we'll turn it over to Khury.
Great, thank you. Right. Well, I'm really grateful to be here. Really honored to share this event with such fantastic people, people who I really admire as well. And I'm really grateful to Progressive Caucus at the Kennedy School for organizing this. And I think that it says a lot, actually, that this event is taking place. And it's critical because there has been and there is a growing conversation, I think, in the US about what a progressive agenda looks like, what an agenda that's concerned with things like social justice, racial justice, economic justice, climate justice, et cetera. What does that all look like? And what does it look like kind of in terms of our big visions and also in terms of policy? I have been concerned that so much of that conversation seems to stop at the US borders. That is, a conversation about a progressive agenda is usually framed in domestic terms. And I think it's really critical for us to grapple with what it looks like in terms of this place in the world, and what the US does all around the world. So I'm very happy to be here. As Joseph said, I research and talk about and write about U.S. power, really, as it's wielded in the Middle East and in the Pacific. And I'm also interested in the resistance movements that challenge that power. So that's what my work kind of looks like. I look at the war on terror and displacement and the ongoing Palestinian freedom struggle, and the work with Toby on US-China rivalry and things like that. What I have for today, what I want to offer for today, are some thoughts that that are let me say this. I think the question of what does a progressive U.S. foreign policy look like? That's quite a provocative question. Is it possible to have a progressive U.S. foreign policy even? And so I have some provocative thoughts, some provocative responses. So please indulge me. And I'll just start by saying at the outset that I think there's any number of particular aspects to what a progressive U.S. foreign policy could look like, I believe. And I'll get into some of those. I'm sure we'll get into a bunch of those in this event. But the big takeaway that I want to put on the table, actually right here from the start, is that a progressive US foreign policy really requires rethinking, and frankly, I would argue rejecting conventional notions of American leadership. So that's a big point, and I'll kind of flesh that out. It has to be said at the moment, and Joseph really spoke to this, that the overwhelming bulk of US foreign policy runs contrary to progressive values like justice and equality. It is an unjust and destructive set of activities. Now, that may not be controversial to say, I think, especially for a gathering like this. But what I want to add is the point that the injustice runs deep. As Joseph spoke to, this isn't the domain of one particular policy, but rather there are threads of injustice that we see running through successive administrations of different parties. And I would argue that stretch really back to the foundations of this project called the United States. But I want to say a word actually when I was thinking about this event and thinking about the Kennedy School, and I live in Boston. I know that there are those of you who are affiliated with the Kennedy School who might not be in Cambridge at the moment, but imagine with me for a second that you're at the Kennedy School, you're in Cambridge, and if you go about a block up from the Charles River, there's this park called Winthrop Square. There's like a Pete's Coffee there. There's usually somebody playing music. Sometimes it's good music. And it's called Winthrop Square because it's named after Governor John Winthrop, the 17th century governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, who was famous for his speech before the sale of the ship Arbella to Massachusetts from England. His speech was called A Model of Christian Charity, better known as a City on a Hill speech. And he says a number of things in this sermon about what society looks like and what it should look like, and Christian values and so on. But he ends with this paragraph that has played quite a role actually in the thinking behind US foreign policy for a long time. So he says, "We shall find that God of Israel is among us. When 10 of us shall be able to resist 1,000 of our enemies, when he shall make us a praise and glory that men shall say of succeeding plantations, may the Lord make it like that of New England. For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us." Now, this speech has been referenced by US presidents from Kennedy to Reagan to Obama. The notion that this colony must be a model Christian project that will set an example for the whole world to aspire to is foundational to things like Manifest Destiny and like American exceptionalism. Now, of course, there are different chapters of the history of the project that came to be called the United States and its foreign policy since the 17th century. But there is a lineage that from that origin to the wielding of US power on the world stage today. And that is all to say that I think when we're talking about that kind of power and things like American exceptionalism, and the injustices that come with that, they run very deep. And with that, I want to actually, to help me kind of illustrate that depth, I want to call to mind the massive outpouring of protests and uprisings against racism that's taken place this year in this country. Because those uprisings have not only targeted particular police killings, of course, they have demanded justice for people like George Floyd and many others, Breonna Taylor, and so on. But they also, those protests put on the table deep problems of anti-Black racism, whose origins lie really in the foundation of the United States. It begs a reckoning. And similarly, I believe that what the United States has done and continues to do abroad begs a reckoning. So developing and advancing progressive visions in these areas, I think, can't involve cosmetic changes. They require real deep transformations. I believe that we need really a deep unsettling of the whole American project. I know that's a massive thing, and I understand that that'll be a process. And so for today, what I've been thinking about when I think about this event is, and what I offer my comments in the vein of, is imagining that we're somewhere along the way of that process. Not at its end goal, but somewhere along the way. So imagine that there's this very progressive US government. I don't know who the president is, I don't know who's in Congress, but imagine AOC is Secretary of State, Ilhan Omar is Secretary of Defense, what should they do? And that's what I want to kind of, the rest of my comments will be about that. So I want to, the other thing I want to put on the table, I'll try to make this this quick because I know this is introductory, but there was this experience that I had when I live in Boston, but I took my job at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. And shortly after moving to D.C. and starting to work at IPS, I went to this event that was, whose subject was about actually the Saudi war in Yemen. And what can be done by advocates of human rights to stop Saudi human rights abuses in Yemen. And it was a symposium that included people from various nonprofits and NGOs, that included people who have worked in the Foreign Service and so on. And this was right after I got to DC, and I have a lousy memory, so I can't remember any of the details about who organized it or who spoke, which is absolutely true, but also very convenient for the purposes of this conversation. So I won't get in trouble and name names. I'll just say what I remember. And so, there was this conversation about, the various horrendous things Saudi Arabia was doing in Yemen. And the question of what the US could do. And really the takeaway was that at the moment, the US is limited in advocating for human rights because there's this failure of American leadership in the form of Donald Trump in the White House. And so essentially that the US can't do much to stop Saudi Arabia. Now, my colleague and mentor, Phyllis Bennis, who also works at IPS, a longtime critic of foreign policy, very thoughtfully and tactfully asked the question, well, what about the US's own role in Yemen? Is there something that could be done about that? And when she asked this panel that question, nobody got offended by pointing the calling attention to what the US was doing. It was as though they just hadn't thought about it. It was as though this was just about critiquing Saudi Arabia when, and perhaps Shireen will get into this, what Saudi Arabia has done with the United Arab Emirates and a number of other states, the United States has been central to that in Yemen. It is with US weapons, US planes, US programs for fueling those planes, US intelligence data. When Saudi Arabia has carried out bombings in Yemen, essentially the US has been part of every step except for the actual dropping of the bomb. And the US carries out its own operations in Yemen, as it has done since at least 2002 under the heading of counterterrorism. So there's any number of things that the US could do and should do, not only in terms of stopping Saudi Arabia's crimes in Yemen, but actually the US's own abuses. And by the way, the US's direct counterterrorism operations by US personnel themselves have killed civilians, and this is well documented. And yet the thinking of the people who are kind of in Washington was such that the advocacy for human rights, it was distorted by this question of American power, when in fact, American power is actually part of the problem. It's centrally part of the problem. So with that, it's kind of warning. And I want to say, when we think about what a progressive foreign policy could look like, I think about a couple of things. One is, I was talking recently to a collaborator, a colleague, Azadeh Shashahani, who is an Iranian critic of US foreign policy at Project South, and based in Atlanta. And we were talking about US policy toward Iran, and she said, it needs to be about dignity, not domination, which I think is an incredibly useful heading. And to elaborate on that, I want to quote from my colleague at IPS, Phyllis Bennis, who wrote a piece in these times about what progressive US foreign policy could look like. She writes, without US domination, the possibility arises of a new kind of internationalism to prevent and solve crises that arise from current and potential wars, to promote nuclear disarmament, to come up with climate solutions, and to protect refugees. I think that's really useful. And of course, there are countless particulars that can be done to advance progressive US foreign policy. I think primarily it involves in stopping US harm that's being committed at the moment and has been committed. So of course, the operations associated with the war on terror should end. The various weapons sales to governments around the world and military aid to governments around the world that are committing human rights abuses, from Saudi Arabia and UAE toward the people in Yemen, to Israel toward Palestinians, the many states around the world carrying out repression with US funds and weapons at this moment, including but not limited to Egypt and Nigeria, all of that should stop. But the general point, I think, is that a progressive foreign policy would mean really joining with the rest of the world to address the problems that are facing humanity and the planet. Climate change, the incredible level of inequality, the pandemics and other public health crises, the mass displacement of people around the world, and so on and so on and so on, and of course, environmental catastrophe. As residents of this planet and of the human community, we all have a responsibility to address these problems. But that can only be done in a just way if it is coupled with the United States actually, I would argue, dismantling its power on the world stage. This means demilitarization, withdrawing the tens of thousands of troops deployed around the world, closing the hundreds of military bases and returning the lands to the countries where they're located. And by the way, those decisions wouldn't be kind of just driven by a conversation in Washington alone. There are social movements in places like Okinawa and South Korea that have been calling for demilitarization and withdrawal of US forces. It means undoing economic arrangements that the US has negotiated to secure to its benefit, but to the loss of countries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. That means debt jubilees, canceling the debts that have trapped formerly colonized nations, and so on. And frankly, it means a lot of repair because the US has caused a lot of damage. Now, that would need to be done alongside a transnational collective conversations and arrangements to address things like climate change, provide for the needs of refugees and other migrants and other vulnerable groups of people, et cetera. Really, I think it means recasting the relationships between this country and others as equals rather than on relations of domination. And I'll just end on the point of Iran, thinking about the various conversations that have to happen, that should happen, because the fact is that the people of Iran and the people of this country are bound together in any number of ways. But at the moment, there have been aircraft carrier groups, at least one, stationed off the coast of Iran for all of this year, at times 2 aircraft carrier groups. There is an incredible sanctions regime on the people of Iran. There have been thousands of US troops added to the Middle East, additional to the thousands that were already there under Trump, as part of what he calls the maximum pressure campaign. No conversation, no honest conversation can take place in that kind of relationship. That must be ended for a conversation and new relationship to emerge. And that's what I hope for that relationship and relations between this country and countries all over the world. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Khury. And now we'll turn over to Shireen.
Well, this was incredible to hear from Khury, and I'm going to share some slides because as I was putting my ideas together, I thought it might be helpful to just, this is how you can reach me, by the way, al-Adeimi at msu.edu or at Twitter at Shireen818. But in thinking about these questions of what should a foreign policy look like, and also what my work has been on challenging US policy, specifically in Yemen, I recently finished reading a book about the creation of the Oxford English Dictionary. And so my instinct was to go and look up the word progressive and see what it means to be progressive. And so here's, Oxford English Dictionary, you have to pay for it, but dictionary.com tells us that as an adjective, progressive means to favor or advocate progress, change, improvement, or reform, as opposed to wishing to maintain things as they are, especially in political matters. And as a noun, it's a person who is progressive or who favors progress or reform, especially in political matters. And so in thinking about things as they are, this is what we want to push against. But like Khury said, he said this so eloquently, but essentially US foreign policy, as it has been for the past centuries and decades, has been characterized by both direct and indirect imperialism, and also war, and what comes with that is war, militarism, and interventions. And these interventions, of course, can be direct intervention, war, occupation, so thinking about Iraq and Afghanistan, and a place like Yemen, which is the worst humanitarian in the world, yet you can have this entire conference, like you mentioned, Khury, and not even recognize the role of the US, that none of this would be happening without the US's support. And I can get into that in just a few minutes. And the idea driving behind all of this is, like you mentioned, American exceptionalism, that we are better than the rest of the world. We have more to offer than the rest of the world, and we deserve better than the rest of the world. And so why not police the rest of the world? Why not invade and impose our own ideas and impose our own systems, our own ideology onto the rest of the world when we can, and we're better, and we should. And so this is what has been driving this, among other things, other concepts, has been driving what we see around the world with foreign policy, US foreign policy. And so what does it mean then this is what I think then we have to be working to oppose, right? So a progressive foreign policy would be a policy that opposes any and all of these things, not one aspect of it, but all aspects of US militarism and interventionism and exceptionalism. And so the injustice that the US has caused around the world has to be undone. And we can't begin to think about a foreign policy unless we think about it as from a space of respect for sovereignty and people's self-determination. We are not exceptional, and we shouldn't be thinking about the rest of the world as less than, as needing our help, needing our assistance, needing our interventions because they can't, direct their own country. I hear this about Yemen all the time, like the Yemenis can't be trusted to lead their own country, to determine their own future. And so the US has to be involved in Yemen, because how could these people decide their own future, right? Cooperation and partnership would follow if you have actually respect for other people and other people's right to self-determination, which again, we don't currently have. We won't cooperate with people because we try to enforce our ideas by force often. Onto other people and nations. This would entail ending US sanctions, US policing across the world, and ending US interventions and all the other ways that the US has intervened and imposed its ideology and hegemony over the world. But none of it would happen without first recognizing and reckoning and having a reckoning of US's wrongdoings within and across our borders. So how do you begin to think about justice and freedom and progressive foreign policy when we're still oppressing people here, and we've never recognized that we've been oppressing them? We're still on stolen land. We haven't acknowledged that, nor have we made any steps to undo some of that injustice. We don't even, reparation is still something that is incredibly, foreign to people. Like, it's not, we haven't even thought about that in any kind of, cogent way, in any organized way, to think about what reparation looks like for slavery, right? And so, we still have migrants at our borders that we continuously abuse and, deny their basic human rights. We have people here at home who can't even walk in their streets without, the fear of being shot or the fear of being persecuted for who they are. And so until we come to a reckoning of all of the ways in which we've harmed people, Black and brown mostly, here at home and at our borders and across the world, then we can't begin to think about how to change that, And I also think that we need to be held accountable. The US government can't just say, well, yep, we recognize all of this, moving on. There is a lot that we have to undo, right? And so whether it's, giving land back, and, my idea is I give it all back, but who's, am I gonna live to see that happen? I don't know. But until we actually undo the things that we've done, I don't think it would really be progressive. Then we're just, maybe we can get at some aspects of this. Maybe we can end some interventions. Maybe we can begin to cooperate with some countries. Maybe we can begin to open our borders in ways that are more humane and just. But I think if we're really thinking long-term and big picture, we really have to work toward, being held accountable to all of the things that our government has been up to over the centuries and over the past decades, and continues to be responsible for. So, I want to get into talking more about this, but in my work specifically on resisting the US's role in Yemen, like Khury mentioned, this has been a war that's now over 5.5 years long, and it's really, war is not the right word for it. It's more like a unilateral attack on a country that can't even defend itself. Because the Saudi-led coalition had, disabled the Yemeni Air Force within the first 24 hours, and then they went on to systematically targeting civilians wherever they were, in their homes, in their hospitals, in their schools, in their funerals, in their weddings. They've systematically targeted food production sites, water desalination plants. They have blockaded the entire country. Yemenis relied on importing 90% of their food and medicine, and now they're completely blockaded, and so they rely on aid. And even the aid has been cut in recent months. So you have a country where 80% of the population is starving and is relying on humanitarian aid that may or may not show up. You have a country where 53% don't have access to hospitals because half of them have been bombed and the other half are barely functioning at 10% capacity, and are dealing with outbreaks because of the sanitation issues that have been the result of all the bombing and the blockading of the fuel as well, have led to the largest cholera outbreak in modern history, with over 2 million people infected. It has led to outbreaks like H1N1 and diphtheria, and now COVID, where we're seeing, even though it's really hard to track and trace cases in Yemen, the cases that have been tracked and have been reported, the fatality rate for those is 30%, which is the highest in the world. And so this is what we've caused in Yemen. We are killing a child every 10 minutes because a child under the age of 5, every 10 minutes, because that child has nothing to eat or that child has no medicine. And yet we don't think about the US as being at war in Yemen, because we no longer have boots on the ground. War looks very different now. So, the hope that Americans might come out in droves like they did during the Vietnam War and oppose US intervention in Yemen is likely not going to happen, because American soldiers are not coming back in body bags, because American soldiers are not even in Yemen. Yet the Saudi-led coalition cannot function in Yemen without the US's support. They don't train their own soldiers. They don't repair their own aircrafts and vehicles. They don't manufacture their own weapons. So Saudi Arabia has become, in the last 5 years, the largest importer of arms, and the US is the largest exporter of arms. They don't train their own pilots. They don't even select their own targets. They rely on US commanders in the command room to select targets in Yemen, and most of the targets have been civilian targets. So whose war is it anyway then? Is it Saudi Arabia's war? Is it the UAE? Or is it really driven by the US? The announcement to invade Yemen was made by the Saudi foreign minister in 2015 from Washington, D.C., not in Arabic and English, not from Saudi Arabia, but from D.C. And so whose war is this, right? And if you ask Yemenis, when they see bombs dropping on them and it says made in the USA, they know that this is the US's war in Yemen, whether or not the average American knows that. So this has been ongoing, like I said, for over 5.5 years, which means that Obama is complicit in war crimes, just as Trump has been complicit in war crimes. It means that Biden is complicit in war crimes because he sat and all of this happened under his watch. And yet, after years and years of advocacy, we managed to get a war powers resolution through Congress in 2019. This was led by Ro Khanna in the House and Senator Bernie Sanders. And, it managed to, for the very first time, so US presidents don't actually have the authority to go to war, not since 1973 at least, when the War Powers Act was passed. But since 1973, every US president has violated that act, and yet no US president has been challenged by Congress until 2019, when we got the War Powers Act passed in the Senate and in the House. Except that if you are following what's happening in Yemen, Trump vetoed that bill, and the veto basically represents an outright commitment to genocide in Yemen and complete disregard to the U.S. Constitution. I don't expect him to regard human lives, but he did swear to protect the Constitution. And so what happened over the years is that Democrats began to see the war as Trump's war in Yemen, and it took a long time to get all Democrats to support an end for the war, even former Obama officials. They'll never recognize their own complicity in it, but they've written to ask Trump to end the war in Yemen. So because of this, we now have Biden, who, while is complicit in this war, has vowed, has promised, has said he would end US support for the war. So this article just came out yesterday. I wrote this, and I wanted to talk to different Yemenis about their perspectives. And I said, I have my own perspectives on this, but I'm not living in Yemen. I have family in Yemen. And this has affected me deeply, but nowhere as deeply as it has affected people in Yemen, of course. And so I asked 3 people in Yemen, they live in different parts, and I asked them what they thought about a Biden presidency. And I'll share 2 perspectives here. One of them is from Mohammed Bahjouj, who lives in Al-Jawf province, that borders Saudi Arabia and has seen some of the worst bombardment over the last 5 years. He is an educator and a trainer of educators, and he has 7 children. And he said, in the article I say, as he watched Biden give his victory speech, Bahjouj noted, Biden is now embracing his grandchildren. We hope that he will remember the poor children of Yemen who are dying every day because of US weapons and the oppressive blockade. Ibrahim Abdul Karim, on the other hand, was not so optimistic. Biden, Abdul Karim adds, is one of the architects of the war in Yemen during the time of Obama, the Democrat. Therefore, I do not differentiate between Trump and Biden. And I have to say that I met Ibrahim on Twitter. I met both of these men on Twitter. But Ibrahim came to my attention in 2015 when a picture of him holding the dead body of his child circulated on Twitter. His child was bombed as they slept in their home in the capital in 2015, which makes this Obama's responsibility as well as the Saudis. So as you can see, and then the third person I interviewed was much more hopeful about Biden's presidency and was eagerly anticipating his victory so that he can end this war once and for all. But as you can see, that all of these people recognize the incredible power the US has in this, not out of benevolence. If Biden ends this, it's not out of benevolence, it's out of pressure that progressives have been putting on over the last several years. It's not out of any moral responsibility, it's just to try to get out of something that has become much more unpredictable and much more destructive than they had hoped. So I look forward to talking some more and hearing other perspectives on this.
Thank you so much, Shireen. And now lastly, we'll turn over to Tobita and then have our discussion after that.
Thank you. I want to talk specifically about the work that we've done around the US-China relationship and the deteriorating US-China relationship. But I want to start out by saying a bit about where I come from in this work and also like some of the worldview shifts that I think are necessary for like progressive foreign policy in general, but also like are maybe like particularly challenging when it comes to the issue of US foreign policy towards China. So I started taking an interest in the US-China relationship and could see that it was on a trajectory of, on like a dangerous trajectory a few years back, escalated during when Trump launched the trade war. And then of course this year accelerated, the rate at which it was deteriorating accelerated rapidly. Sort of a turning point was when I sort of arrived at some clarity that as the US-China relationship deteriorates, that was going to bleed into increased anti-Chinese and more generally anti-Asian racism in the U.S. And that's played out pretty dramatically this year with a sharp rise in acts of harassment and even assault against people of Chinese descent in the U.S. and also like people of a range of other Asian ethnicities that a lot of people in the U.S. can't tell us apart. And I think like the important point is that the way that the U.S. Treats me and people who look like me, and the way that the U.S. treats China are linked. In that more generally, the fate of people who come from various diasporas are inextricably linked to U.S. foreign policy, and we've seen this over and over again in U.S. history. But I think, more universally than that, like whether or not you have some sort of tie to China or some other perceived enemy through your identity, I think it's, a good place to ground ourselves is, to quote Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., we are all caught up in an inescapable garment of mutuality. Whatever affects one of us directly affects all of us indirectly. And injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So like, we don't all share the same fate in this world. Some of us are much more vulnerable than others. But our fates are all tied together. And I think there's a really important shift in worldview that we need in progressive foreign policy, where like either explicitly or implicitly, the rights and well-being of people in other countries and in countries that are perceived to be enemies of the United States, that the rights and well-being of those people are seen as at odds with the flourishing of people in the United States. And I think like when we take like a long-term view of things, like that is false. That's like an incredible act of ideology and propaganda to set the well-being and the future of people in the United States as somehow in tension with the future and well-being of people in other countries. So I think that's like a major shift in values and worldview that we need in U.S. foreign policy. And I think, going beyond that, it's important to critique U.S., like Khury said, we need to critique the idea of American leadership and start to build alternatives that are more cooperative and less based on domination. But at the same time, the U.S. has a crucial role to play in shifting things in the U.S. Has a crucial role to play in creating a more just society. There was a slogan from the U.S. Social Forum that I like a lot. Another world is possible. Another U.S. is necessary. So another like more just, more environmentally sustainable world is possible. But the U.S., like change in the U.S. is absolutely crucial to that. And a lot of the changes that we need to see around the world aren't possible without some radical changes in the U.S. So, the work here that we do here in the U.S. Has like just crucial global significance. Okay, so now a bit about our work at Justice is Global. We're a project at People's Action, which is a national community organizing network. We were founded there last June. And we work on in like a few different dimensions. So a big part of what we do is analysis, engaging in analysis of both the US-China conflict specifically, but also the global economic system more generally. And we see these things as like crucially linked, and we think this is a really important point. The worsening US-China relationship is, in our view, part of a broader global trend, and that has like deep causes within the global system. This dynamic of deteriorating US-China relationship is a product of increasing nationalism and a tendency towards authoritarianism in both countries. But it's not just in the US and in China. We see a growing trend towards nationalist and authoritarian movements and political leaders in China, in the US, but also in India, in Brazil, in the Philippines, Myanmar, Hungary, Poland, the list goes on and on. This has been a serious trend in global politics over the past decade. And we need to see it as a single global trend with global causes. It's not a coincidence that we see these trends in on all these continents in this same period. And our analysis of this is that this has to do with growing dysfunctions in the global economy and in the existing neoliberal global economic order. Briefly, I think the story is that we had the financial crisis in 2008 and the Great Recession. The Great Recession officially ended, but the global economy never fully returned to health. And I mean health, like by the standards of the capitalist system. And a key indicator of economic health under capitalism is economic growth. And a problem that we have seen globally is that economic growth at the global level has been anemic. It's been very weak and of very poor quality. And what that has created is a sense of zero-sum competition between different national economies and zero-sum competition between the national governments that are responsible for managing those national economies. In that sense of zero-sum competition, where all these different countries are competing for a shrinking, they're competing for a share of this shrinking pie of global economic growth, that feeds a mentality of zero-sum competition between nations, that feeds nationalism, and that feeds these authoritarian movements. So we see this underpinning of these worrying political trends, including in the US and in China. And a result of that is the growing US-China conflict, but it has deep causes in these dysfunctions within the global economy. We think this analysis is important because we think that we go wrong if we say that the problem is China, is just China, that's the problem. We go wrong if we say the problem is just Trump. The problem is systemic, and we need to understand the system, and we need our policy fights to work towards a horizon of transforming the global system to overcome these dysfunctions, and so that we can relieve the pressures that are pushing the US, China, and a whole range of other countries towards increasing nationalism and increasing international conflict. Okay, so that's the grounding analysis in a nutshell. So coming out of that, we've done a bunch of different kinds of work, particularly this year as the US-China relationship has gotten just way worse under the pandemic. So some of our work is around narrative and messaging, and finding forms of narratives of international cooperation that we can use to counter this increasing nationalistic dominant narrative that we have seen emerge this year. And we've seen some very promising results from this work. We've convened groups from different sectors to talk about how the worsening US-China relationship is impacting work on a whole range of issues, from public health to climate, of course, foreign policy. We talk about the ways that it has translated into racism and policies of racial profiling here in the US. We work with community organizations and Chinese and Asian American groups to talk about how is this dynamic affecting the work that we all do, and shifting the terrain that we operate on across a wide range of issues. And we also recently launched a campaign for global cooperation to end the pandemic. Lots of different aspects to this, but a couple of things that I think we're going to dig into more in the near future are first, the way that intellectual property rights and the global patent system is threatening to lock global South countries out of access to vaccines and other medications. Second piece is looking at debt and financing, again, particularly for the global South, the way that the economic fallout from the pandemic is threatening to just destroy the finances, particularly in global South countries. More broadly, like we're working towards building an alternative to a progressive alternative to great power competition with China, this idea of great power competition or a new Cold War with China, but one that importantly doesn't fall into this trap that we see all too frequently on the left, where people start to, in the name of opposing US aggression against China, make excuses for the Chinese state in Chinese capital, trying to downplay or make excuses for what's happening in Xinjiang, the crackdown in Hong Kong, threats towards Taiwan, the bullying of countries in the South China Sea on the part of China and that sort of thing. So we don't want to make excuses for the Chinese state and Chinese capital or let them off the hook for these abuses, while at the same time trying to counter these increasing anti-China policies within the US. So that's like a tricky needle to thread, but that's the mission. So I think, looking at what sorts of policies we need. So again, the horizon is to transform the global economy at a structural level. And like that's what's necessary to get us out of this deterioration in the US-China relationship. But along the way, some immediate steps that we can take are first to fight for forms of like just common sense forms of global cooperation, including between the US and China around the pandemic. The US and China need to work together to make sure that vaccines and other medications are distributed fairly around the world. The US and China need to work together to ensure that debt crises don't destroy a whole range of global South countries. So like already, just last week, Zambia entered into, they defaulted on a series of debts to private lenders, private creditors from the West. A big problem there was that there was a conflict between Western creditors and Chinese creditors, and Zambia was like stuck in the middle, and that torpedoed the negotiations that the Zambian government was engaged in to try to get some debt relief. In order to resolve that problem, which is going to hit other countries too, if we don't do something about it, like these two actors need to figure out something together, like China and the US and other actors allied with the US and the West. Beyond that, we need to look at global cooperation around climate change. That's going to be a major issue in the Biden administration. I think there are some opportunities there, also some threats, depending on the direction that the Biden administration takes on this stuff. But this is, again, a place where we need global cooperation. It's also a place where we can start to make these sort of structural changes to the global economy, because the neoliberal status quo is not going to allow us to pursue the climate solutions that we really need at the global level. So getting clear on that and moving new forms of global climate policy, like on the model of a Green New Deal, but taken up to the international level. That's both what we need in order to address climate. It's also going to be a major step along the way to the structural reform of the global economy that we really need. So yeah, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tobita, and thank you all three of you for really rich and enlightening discussion. I want to open us up now to questions, and so I encourage everyone to post their questions in the Q&A function on Zoom. We have one question already from Morgan Pratt, who says, one of the consequences of this increased nationalism and zero-sum thought is manufactured consent / propaganda. Many of the students at HKS who study the US-China relationship rely heavily upon this type of media for information, and as a result, become very in line with the dysfunctional US strategy. Do you have any advice on how to reach these students while they are still reachable? So maybe Tobita start us off with that one, and if anyone else would like to respond as well.
So I wonder about this. So like a bit more about our narrative work. Over the summer, we convened a team of volunteers and did phone banking into to voters in Michigan and Pennsylvania, so these two important swing states, and engaged them in these deep conversations about what they were hearing and feeling about the pandemic and China. And we tested forms of narratives around global cooperation, and also around like the racist impacts that this was having on people of Chinese descent in the US, to like figure out ways to like move people off of these anti-China narratives and start to reflect on them. And had a lot of success around that. Like one of my big takeaways there is that we can see in polling that anti-China sentiment has expanded drastically this year. But what we found in this phone banking experiment is like, we encountered a lot of this anti-China sentiment, but it was quite shallow. Like most people haven't processed this stuff very deeply. So, just bringing them through some counter narratives within the space of like a 15-20 minute conversation can move them significantly off of this stuff. Because, they'll be like, it's like, it can be as simple as like, yeah, like Chinese people are being targeted because the Trump keeps saying China virus. Did you know that? And they're like, oh, no, actually I've never talked to a Chinese person. Like I've never talked to a Chinese American person, right? Like it's just not part of their experience. So anyway, so that was successful. I wonder though, if students at the Harvard Kennedy School might be a different kettle of fish and more difficult because they've reflected much more deeply about this stuff, which means, there's some good there, like they're more informed in some ways, but there's also going to be more like ideological baggage that can come along with that. I wonder though if the same sort of narrative and worldview levers are still a good place to start, like really emphasizing the importance of global cooperation around things like the pandemic, around climate change, around what is, I think, has got to be a very deep economic crisis that we don't totally realize yet. Like these are shared global challenges, and are we serious about actually coming up with solutions to them? Because if you are, there's some consequences for how you deal with this stuff. And yeah, I don't know. Like I think in terms of like critiquing some of the standard media narratives, that's tricky. So I can't say that I've like tested this a lot, but I think like as a general approach, I think what's important is to recognize that there are totally legitimate critiques that are the basis of these media narratives, like these dominant media narratives about China and the US-China conflict. The problem is like how one-sided they get. So like, I think a kind of conversation to engage folks in is like, yeah, that is a problem that we see in China, but can you see how that is part of like a global problem that more often than not, the US is also implicated in, right? So the persecution of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, part of the story there is US cooperation with China in creating what the Chinese government itself calls the People's War on Terror. This was part of the US war on terror. Like the US played a role in like feeding into the what has now become this system of persecution in Xinjiang, and the Islamophobia in China. There's widespread Islamophobia in China that legitimates this persecution of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. That's not just a problem in China. Like that is a global problem, and the US-led war on terror has played a major role in feeding that. Like we see it in China, in India, in the Middle East, like it's all over the place, right? You can have a similar conversation around like the abuses of Chinese tech companies, right? Like, yes, Chinese tech companies violate people's privacy. Guess who else does that? Facebook does that. Twitter does that. Like, can you reflect on how this is a global problem that US actors and US firms and the US government are like also complicit in? And like, so expanding it to these global systems, getting people out of this like one-sided sort of Orientalist critique of like, these are all problems like that we only find in China, I think is an important step.
Shireen or Khury, are there any things you'd want to add?
I mean, I think the same problem exists with following any U.S. narrative on any issue. So I wasn't involved in politics before 2015, and now I write quite extensively and give talks like this and presentations and whatnot on Yemen. Even though I'm a teacher educator, I teach teachers how to teach kids how to read and write, right? So it's not part of my day job, so to speak. But I think the importance here is creating those counter stories, creating those counter narratives, and for us to tell our own stories so that they're not co-opted by this certain dominant narrative. And sometimes people ask me, well, what should I read and what shouldn't I read? And I tell them, read everything, but you just have to really be critical and ask questions about what you're reading. So you can't read an article about Yemen, for example, without seeing the phrase Iran-backed Houthis. And yet Iran is not involved in Yemen. And yet US-backed, in fact, means this is a US-led war, so those words aren't even used the same way at all. But part of the reason Saudi Arabia gets to justify why they're in, at least to the US or to the global stage or to its neighbors, why it's involved in Yemen is to counter perceived Iranian aggression. So read everything, but then ask yourself, well, where's the evidence for this, right? Yemen is under total land, air, and sea blockade. Where are these mysterious Iranian weapons coming in from when food and water and the UN has to even seek permission to enter Yemen? People are trapped in the country. There are no Yemeni refugees because they're trapped. So where are all of these Iranians coming in and going from? And then you get to hear some of the preposterous theories and narratives out there, which is that they're crossing through Oman, through al-Qaeda land and ISIS land, which is controlled by the coalition and al-Qaeda in the south, and then getting to northern Yemen with the Houthis. And then the idea starts to fall apart, So just really critiquing the dominant narrative, no matter what it is, and being on your toes. Just because you read about it, just because it's repeated so often, it doesn't mean that it's true.
Yeah, I mean, there's not too, I mean, I completely agree, not too much to add to that. I think that's really useful because as both Toby and Shireen said, these stories are, they're repeated so often that they take on, there's a kind of echo chamber, in Washington and really throughout the US media, particularly when we talk about places like China and like Iran in the kind of dominant US mind. This notion that like China doesn't play by the rules, or Iran is the sponsor of the greatest sponsor of world terrorism, and it's like, well, okay, so what's the evidence? As Shireen just said, it's worth actually asking those questions, and it seems people actually come out short. And if they can provide evidence, and as Toby said, these things are not specific to places like China and Iran, and I think it's part of the kind of ideology of an enemy, that it's not just that there's some problem that China or Iran is carrying out, but there's something specific to China, specific to Islam, specific to Iran, that makes it so this problem can't be dealt with other than through an aggressive confrontation. But the last thing I'll just say on that point is this whole notion of an enemy, and again, this goes to like the deeper critique. Like, I challenge folks to think, particularly folks whose work is going to be, the administration of U.S. power. Yeah, I challenge folks to think about, like, has there been a time in the history of this country when there wasn't some enemy? And if not, why is that so essential to the kind of outlook, on the part of the United States? I mean, I mentioned the Winthrop City on a Hill speech and this idea of creating this sort of shining example for the world to follow. And Winthrop presided, of course, over wars against the native population here in what he and others called New England. Why has there always been an enemy, and what utility does that provide? And in what ways is your thinking, Kennedy School graduate student, in what ways is your thinking falling into a construct rather than looking at the world more honestly and with more nuance and more critically, frankly?
Yeah, and I think that transitions us really well into the next audience question, which just got posted, and they asked if they're wondering if the group could discuss strategies for countering the outsized influence of the Department of Defense in government and the national security profession in DC more generally. Um, and they're particularly interested to hear Tabita's thoughts on this regarding the DoD's cheerleading for great power competition as an inevitability as opposed to a self-fulfilling prophecy.
I have a quick take on this, which is, you know, the problem in foreign policy and in national security discourse is, like it's a part of U.S. policy that, like, it's, I don't know, maybe the most undemocratic part of U.S. policy, where there's just, you know, a small handful of people who get to dominate the conversation, and everyone else in the country is like disempowered, right? Um, and then you get these ideas of like the national interest that are totally disconnected from the interests of like 99% of like people who are humans living in the US. Um, so, and you know, we see this, like, you know, is this war on Yemen a national security issue? Is this in the national interests of the United States? Well, that's the dominant view. Try to spell that out in terms of like how this is benefiting any human being that lives in the US. You can't. Um, I think like the major step there is to like build the power and capacity of ordinary people, and this is going to have to happen through like grassroots people-powered organizations, to weigh in on these conversations and to become like a powerful voice of critique and start to pick some fights with the dominant voices. I think like we need to build more like people power, organized people power around this stuff, and that's gonna be a major part of how we start to shift this discourse.
If I can just add to that, you know, the only people that this benefits is, you know, Boeing and General Dynamics and Raytheon and Lockheed Martin. And so we don't, you know, we really have to think about their influence on Congress as well. What does it mean that these companies have such influence and power over sitting senators? That, you know, it took us a while to get Rhode Island senators to agree to any anti-war thing related to Yemen, because Textron is based in Rhode Island, and you know, they were selling cluster bombs to the Saudis despite its illegality, of course, and the Saudis were dropping them in Yemen. And once Textron stopped selling the cluster bombs, then those senators came on board. And so, you know, you have Raytheon in Massachusetts, you have all of these companies that are benefiting so much, and have specifically made, you know, tens of billions of dollars from the war in Yemen alone. And yet, you know, they get to have so much sway as though they are doing some kind of national service to the people of the United States, and they're not.
Yeah, if I can say one thing too, I think that you know, so there's and there's so much to say structurally about how those relations are cultivated, which Shireen was just talking about. Like, how is it that Boeing or Raytheon actually buys, you know, support and otherwise achieves influence in Washington? I think too that there's like that outsized power. It's there's something too about it that's reflective of what has been tremendous unity, I think, in Washington on the notion of a war on terror as a framework, as an overarching framework, and national security as an overarching framework for achieving any number of goals for the people, by the people who run this country. And it's worth saying, you know, I'll say I'll come back to this country, but that has been, it's not only this country, it's actually been a gift to countries around the world. Many states have declared war on terror because there's something convenient about it to identify whatever problem they want to target as terrorism or a threat to national security, right? So, okay, but that said, back to the United States, where, which really led on it. Any number of issues now have been recast as questions of homeland security. The question of immigration, is prior to the September 11th attacks. Of course, there's a long history of criminalization of racism directed toward populations of folks who migrate to the United States. But the notion that Central American migrants or migrants coming up, crossing the US-Mexico border are not only threats to our jobs, our American jobs, but also our potential vehicles for terrorism, are a threat to homeland security, undermine the collective safety. That's part of a new kind of recasting of all of the problems that the people who run this country, the political class, has identified is useful. When corporations decide that certain kinds of work is essential, in the weeks and months after 9/11, there were workers on docks who wanted to organize for labor rights, and that was considered a potential terror threat. Well, the problem of capital and labor precedes the war on terror, but there became a useful heading, right, to continue and kind of enhance what those people were going to do anyway. So I think that all of these notions of national security, homeland security, really need to be ruthlessly critiqued. And we need to look at the kind of society that has been crafted under that heading: the surveillance, the violence, the repression, and it affects, of course, things domestically. This is, again, related to the uprisings that we saw against police violence earlier this year, as well as what the US carries out around the world.
Yeah, if I can just add another thought to that. I think I missed this question about how to counter the great power competition is inevitable narrative. I think there's a couple of things here. One is to emphasize the need for global cooperation and to clarify that these things are actually in contradiction. Like, we can't, there's this idea, I think, in sort of the Biden administration and sort of the mainstream of the Democratic Party, that, they agree with Republicans and Trump that, we're locked into this competition. However, we're going to do it in a moderate way where we can both do competition and cooperate around these like deep global challenges like the pandemic and climate change. And I think this is not a sustainable strategy, especially how like the extremely deep and challenging forms of cooperation that are going to be necessary to address these challenges. So like we need to like expose that contradiction, and so like we need to choose like what is our priority, and do a better job of like organizing the forces that have a stake in global cooperation, which is a lot of people in the United States. It's a lot of organizations that work on a whole range of issues like public health, like climate change, even economic justice. Like that's a harder story to tell, but there's a story there about economic justice in the US depends on global cooperation as well. And also draw upon the people who are being directly impacted by the growth of these national security narratives, and that's particularly like the Chinese diaspora, and organize those forces and like make their voices heard within these DC circles where policy gets set. Like that's the challenge. So a lot of this is like, some of it is like figuring out what are the right narratives, but a lot of this is just an organizing challenge. And I'm going to drop a link in the chat. So Pew Research did some, encouraging polling, and there's a lot of support for global cooperation. That they're just not organized and they're not felt in DC enough.
Thank you so much, Tobita. We have a question in the chat from Francis, but it looks like it was cut off slightly. So Francis, if you could either put the full question in the chat or resend it to the Q&A, I can ask that next. But in the meantime, I'll ask a question of my own, which is, I think all of you touched on this already, but Khury, I know that early on, you mentioned that, discussions of a progressive agenda tend to end at the US border. And you all, I believe, spoke to how, the need for accountability within the United States and the atrocities the United States have committed play out in US foreign policy. But I'm interested to hear you all speak to the inverse of that, like how US foreign policy also doesn't stop at the US border and comes to infiltrate the United States itself. And you've all spoken this a bit, but I know, Khury, you had a recent piece talking about how the connecting the war on terror to what we were seeing this summer this summer and fall in Portland with federal agents, using tactics against protests against racism that are more commonly part of the war on terror. So I'm curious to hear what you all think about how foreign policy influences the domestic sphere in the United States and what we can do to address that.
Yeah, should I start?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Cool. Yeah, no, I so appreciate that, because I really think of when I think of U.S. violence, I think of it in terms of circuits. Like there's violence that it's really, I mean, this place called the United States itself is a kind of incubator for a violence that then gets deployed elsewhere, right? So I think about the fact that the United States has invaded many nations around the world, and the first nations or the native nations, the indigenous nations here. And that's not incidental. And in fact, the military has any number of ways to remind us of that in terms of their weapon systems that they refer to as Tomahawk missiles and Apache helicopters. And they, in carrying out the operation that killed Osama bin Laden, codenamed him Geronimo, naming him after the indigenous rebel freedom fighter, and so on. So there's that. Of course, there's the violence that's been incubated, directed at the Black population here in the US as well, which also gets deployed abroad in any number of ways. But exactly as you said, it's also the case that the US carries out violence that then gets abroad, that ends up getting brought back here. And so I think about, there's any number of long, historic examples of that. Before we get to Portland, which I will in a second. But I think about, for example, in the 1980s and 90s, there was this horrific torture ring organized out of this precinct in Chicago, on the south side of Chicago, that tortured many dozens of Black people over years before finally being ended due to activist protest. And the police officers who carried out that violence actually learned those tactics as soldiers in Vietnam, in the US's war in Vietnam, that they then brought back to the streets of Chicago to use against Black people as police officers. So I think that those kinds of circuits are really important. In the article that Joseph referred to points to what happened in Portland, Oregon this past year, when I think many people in the US were horrified, rightly horrified, by seeing unidentified federal agents disappear people in unmarked cars in Portland. And that is horrifying. It absolutely should have garnered the response that it did. And yet those agents and the institutions that carried that out, it's not like they were invented in that moment, right? I mean, this is precisely what ICE does in immigrant communities. That is precisely their role. Unmarked agents all the time disappear people and take them to locations away from their families. And of course, in the war on terror, through the rendition programs and any number of other programs, the United States has perfected actually seizing people with no legal recourse at all. So I think that this gets at some of the other questions that were asked as well. The question of security, national security, because one reason why I think that elected officials use those headings and get away with assigning them to broad categories of activity by the state is that they also render the activity of particularly the US military and the CIA and other security agencies. They render that invisible here in the US, right? Like actually, like the fact that the US has been at war with multiple countries for 2 decades for the most part, it's not really discussed in the U.S. and in the media or anywhere else. Incredible violence. In fact, thousands of U.S. personnel cycle through countries as soldiers and return. There's precious little conversation about that. So I think that one of the things that needs to be done, that we need to do, is help reveal when they say security, what does that actually look like? And part of it is it looks like militarized police, in the streets of the U.S. And again, that's longstanding. The policing of Black folks goes back to the enslavement of Black folks, right? But those histories rooted in this place combine with what the U.S. does abroad, and we have to reveal all of it in the various circuits and connections.
Thank you, Khury. Tobita or Shireen, do you have anything you would want to add to that?
Yeah, I think, let's see. So a few pieces are the way that the bloated Pentagon budget acts as like a force that undermines spending on domestic priorities. Like right now, realistically, so there's this, there's this conversation around, do we need more industrial policy in the US? And I think, yes, I think that's a very important progressive priority. Actually, we do have like a very powerful form of industrial policy. It's the military industrial complex. Like that is the premier form of industrial policy that the US currently engages in with bipartisan support, right? And there's like, I think, this idea of like shifting funding from the military to policies and systems that can support, that can meet human needs is a really important fight. So there's a major implication for domestic policy there. The way that militarism abroad feeds racism here, and violence abroad feeds violence here that Khury talked about. I think another big thing though is status quo US foreign policy is locking us into a century of like escalating global crises around public health, around the economy, around the global economy, around climate. And there is no border and no wall that can protect the United States from these global crises. If climate change continues to worsen, we don't have a wall that extends up to the stratosphere, right? Like if we do not create solutions for the whole world, including China, including for the global South, and work together with everybody to solve this problem, like we're going down with the rest of the ship. If we don't get together with China and with every other country in the world to like solve this emerging global crisis that are coming with the pandemic, a global economic crash is going to take down the US economy with it. The border, the wall, like nothing's going to keep that out, right? So we're part of a global system, and the future of that global system determines the future of the United States, and US foreign policy has a huge impact on the future of that global system.
Whatever was said is fantastic. I also wrote a piece this summer with Sarah Lazar for In These Times, where we explore how the bloated US military strengthens the police state. Everything from counterinsurgency, that's the manual that was written for counterinsurgency manual that was written for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Those tactics get used here at home with policing Black communities and Muslim communities, and in unleashing the National Guard on protesters like we've seen this summer. Even the conversation of the $740 billion per year budget of the Pentagon doesn't even get, it has bipartisan support, like you said, Tobita. So, and even this, the suggestion to cut it by 10%, only 10 senators voted for that proposal. So this is a bipartisan, entrenched dedication to militarism that ends up harming people here at home and certainly abroad, but also there's clear cooperation between police and military in ways that are, increasingly destructive.
Thank you, everyone. And so now I'll turn to Francis's question in the chat, which had a quick note about what we were talking about earlier, saying that the reason Textron stated they stopped the production of cluster bombs was because they saw growing congressional opposition to the war in Yemen, and they were concerned about future profitability. And Francis also asks, is curious what folks think the order of issue priorities should be going into the next administration. And I would also add on to that, what priorities and actions should there be for movements and who want to influence the administration? And anyone can start.
I think we can walk and chew gum, as they say. I don't know if it necessarily has to be one thing at a time. The more progressive policies we push through grassroots action and, like these have to be our causes. Like you said, climate change, we're all in this together, right? Bombs dropping on people in our name should be something everybody's concerned about. And we have to be pushing any number of these policies, all of them, as much as possible, and not make excuses for people that, oh, well, they're so busy with COVID that they can't think about war. Well, clearly they're still managing war just fine, right? And so, I think we have to start treating our elected officials like our employees. We elect them, and we should expect them to represent our views. And if we abdicate on that responsibility, then we're allowing things to happen in our name, and we become complicit. And so I think the more we can push, the earlier, the better.
Khury or Tabita?
Yeah, I mean, this is the question is daunting, of course, because there's so much that has to be done. But I do think that the war on terror just has to be, this has to be the beginning of the end of the war on terror. I think that that's what we need to declare. And that means all of its overseas operations and all of its domestic surveillance. And here's my cat now also. Hi. So yeah. All the domestic surveillance and Islamophobic restrictions, the restrictions at the border have to be ended. But I mean, again, there's not enough of a conversation about what the U.S. is doing abroad. People have no idea, I think, or many people don't know what the U.S. is doing in Somalia, for example, where the number of civilian casualties has escalated due to U.S. so-called counterterrorism operations. And that's true in any number of countries around the world. So I think that's really critical to have those conversations. One hopeful thing and very interesting thing is that there's a growing willingness in the government among elected officials, small but very significant, to challenge the kind of bipartisan orthodoxy in terms of US support for Israel and a growing recognition of the human rights of Palestinians. So that's very significant. And I think that that's reflective of the incredible work, it's happened at the grassroots organizations like Students for Justice in Palestine, Jewish Voice for Peace, and many others. So we need to expand that. Again, Palestine is a good conversation, I think, re-emerging around Yemen. I am very worried about the US-China rivalry, just because the level of unity in Washington is so high. I mean, there are elected officials who are willing to say that the US should no longer be in Afghanistan, or other carrying out other operations in the war on terror, even if there's very little questioning of the war on terror overall. But there is virtually no, from what I can see, dissent, on the question of precisely as somebody said, the self-fulfilling prophecy of a conflict with China because of the actions that the United States is taking. So I really think it's important for those of us who see that to call attention to that right away.
Yeah. So let me go back to this question of the first 100 days. I think it'll be important to get some quick action around the pandemic. So that's like the pressing thing. And I think, on the side of like executive action, I'm hoping to see some action on getting special drawing rights at the IMF. This is a form of providing financial relief, especially to global South countries that are being threatened by debt crises. And the US government has been the major obstacle to this measure at the IMF. And that opposition, incidentally, has been motivated by a fear that if we allow this increased financial space to global South countries, somehow the money will make its way to Iran or China. So again, these like boogeymen of Iran and China are like, it's a major force that has gotten the US government to take this just disastrous position for like billions of people around the world. I think there's stuff that we need to do around making sure a vaccine is globally accessible. And there's some things around like patent pools and some measures at the WTO that could help. And these don't just address like the immediate crisis, but we can also use them as an opportunity to ask deeper questions about the structure of the global system. So I think, we can address some immediate issues while also setting the stage for some further fights. Apart from that, I think just like we need a lot more power and capacity around these questions. And I just want to come back to something I said before that, in part, this is like a narrative question, a research question, but I think most fundamentally, it's an organizing question. How do we organize more people who understand their stake in these issues, which can both include like politicizing people who are already engaged in progressive politics. It can also include like bringing in more people who are directly impacted, like members of various diasporas, organizing them and increasing their power and capacity to raise these questions because they're already clear about their stake in a lot of these issues. But I think like research and also like developing alternative narratives and just finding out more about these stories that are left out of mainstream media and getting a more nuanced perspective is like really important. Actually, let me see. I got to drop a set of resources here that I'll drop in the chat, specifically around China. So these are all like online, and these are good places for like some alternative takes on a lot of what's happening between the US and China that in various ways sort of question this binary of US versus China nationalism.
Thank you, Tobita. Those resources look great and can't wait to check them out. And thank all of you for all of those great answers. We're coming up on time now. So I want to give you each a little bit of space to, make some closing remarks. But to give you time to prepare those, I also want to just do a quick thank you to everyone who came to this, who watched this for any amount of time. And it's been recorded, so we'll make it available online and you can share it with anyone else you'd like. And if you want to be up to date on future Progressive Caucus events or publications, you can follow us at Twitter at progressive_HKS. And so thank you everyone once again, and I will turn it over to our wonderful panelists to get the last word. And whoever feels ready.
I can go. Thank you so much for hosting. I think I just want to leave people with the idea that, there's hope, and hope is the only thing that certainly keeps me going. I have family in Yemen who's deeply affected by this, and it's not just Yemen. We end the war in Yemen, we end wars in Afghanistan, and Iraq, and Somalia, and so on. These are all connected struggles, and I hope that people will join us in thinking about each other as one connected global community. And if we recognize that our oppressors are, the same, we have much more power to dismantle these structures. So I hope that people don't give up despite how difficult it is. I know certainly a lot of times I feel like giving up, but I remember that I have the privilege to even think that and others don't, because they have to live under sanctions, under war, under bombs, under blockade. And so those are the people who keep me going, and I hope that people will feel inspired that, you know, there is a lot of work to do, but it is doable.
I could go next. Yeah, thank you so much for this. I'm really grateful for all of this. And one thing, just real quick, I want to shout out one thing that Francis said in the chat about sanctions relief. And the U.S. sanctions that target people all around the world need to be lifted. In particular, I'd call attention to the sanctions on Iran and all of the activities that have been done under the heading of maximum pressure. That should be one of the things that we demand an immediate end to, every single aspect of those. So, I'll just wrap up by pointing to something that Toby said that I think was really important about there actually is no wall that can address the problems brought by climate change, by the public health crises like the COVID crisis, and so on. And that points to this whole question of national security, homeland security, again, as the heading and militarized solutions for the problems that people face, to speak to the real, there is real anxiety across this country for any number of reasons, because of the economic instability, the social instability, the addiction crises, the environmental catastrophes, right? Like there are real problems that exist in this country and all around the world. And the story that there is a military solution to those things, it's not only oppressive, it's not only horrendous, what is done to children at the border in the name of that, or what is done to people in Yemen and Somalia and Afghanistan in the name of that. It is also false. The idea that America First or any version of that will actually provide for a future worth living in is simply not true. And so I think that we have to craft a different set of stories that not only are about addressing those injustices and undoing them, but also pointing, developing positive visions that point us to the future. And I'll end on what I'm very inspired by, which are these incredible, all around the world, these uprisings over the past couple of years for justice, whether what's happening in Nigeria at the moment, what happened last year, and it continues to happen in Puerto Rico, in places like Chile, in Ecuador, in Peru at the moment, in Hong Kong, in Lebanon, in Iraq, and actually the struggles and uprisings for racial justice in this country. These all, they target particular injustices, but within them, people are talking about the deep problems that are rooted in our societies and starting to imagine what could things look like in different ways. And I think that that's the hope. And so our social movements, how can we build those? And as we dismantle the harmful institutions, develop some positive visions that are actually not only righteous, but that are frankly honest and compelling, because there are real, climate change is a real problem. The displacement crisis is real. We have to step up to that, but that requires a more just worldview and outlook, and a hopeful one.
I want to end on the point about, this is in large part an organizing task, but like flipping that in a positive and hopeful way. National security debates have been so thoroughly insulated from anything like the majority of people in this country think. I think there's an enormous opportunity here to pick progressive foreign policy fights and like bring those into like the rarefied air of like DC foreign policy circles, backed by organized people power. And I think like the foreign policy establishment is not ready for that. Like if we build that, like we will take them by surprise. Like they're just so used, like when I listen to these people, they're so used, I don't know, some of them might be your professors or whatever, so whatever. When I listen to these people, they're so stuck within like their tiny worldview. like they don't even consider questions or critiques that come from outside of it. So they're just not ready to deal with this stuff. And I think, like the people are out there, the foreign policy establishment is out of touch with popular sentiment in this country. The people are out there that we can organize, and as well within like more established progressive organizations. I think as progressive groups start to build power and feel like we're having more of a say within policy debates, the implications of status quo U.S. foreign policy for the issues that everyone works on are starting to become clearer, right? Like, so climate groups are getting clearer, like, oh, this international stuff, this foreign policy stuff matters a lot to us, right? So there's a lot of opportunity for us and some space for us in the next 2 to 4 years to build a much more powerful front on progressive foreign policy and bring that to bear on the foreign policy establishment in DC. And I think we can make some real gains there, and it could be a lot of fun to get into those fights.
Thank you all so much. It's hard to do a round of applause over Zoom, but I'll just, for everyone's sake, I'll thank you, all three of you. This has been an incredible discussion, and we're so appreciative of your time and your generosity and the important work that you all do. And so that wraps this up, but thank you so much, and we hope to talk with you soon.
Thank you so much.